Good evening, everybody, and a warm welcome to the Intellectual Forum. My name is Eleanor O'Gorman. I'm the incoming Deputy Director at the IF. It has been running since 2016, and we host regular public events across culture, history, science, and everything in between. And there's no exception tonight. We're very happy to be the precursor to a workshop tomorrow, history workshop, hosted by Dr. Molly Arbuthnot from the college, and this event has been supported by the IF. We welcome everybody also joining us on Zoom and from around the world tonight for this lecture and distinguished guest. I'm going to hand you over to Dr. Arbuthnot to make the introductions. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you to Eleanor for those warm words of welcome, and to the IF for hosting this event, especially to the IF staff. Is it on? Oh, okay. Especially to the IF staff for all of their work behind the scenes helping make it happen. My name is Molly Arbuthnot. I am a research fellow here at Jesus College, and it falls to me to introduce our speaker this evening, and it is a great pleasure and privilege to welcome Professor Sheila Fitzpatrick back to Cambridge. I imagine for most people in the room, Sheila requires no introduction, given that she is an authority, of course, on the history of Russia and the Soviet Union and histories of migration and displacement in the 20th century, as well as, of course, the author of a wide range of non-fiction books, articles, memoirs, to the extent that I think anyone with an interest in history has probably encountered her work. But for those of us in Soviet studies, it is say legendary, career covering 5 decades, in which she has truly laid the foundations of the field in a way that I think few scholars can claim to have done. And tonight we're really lucky to hear some of her most recent work, which will be on displacement in and from Soviet Russia. Her most recent book, The Shortest History of the Soviet Union, was published last year, and the next one, make sure I get this right, is entitled Lost Souls, Displaced Persons and the Birth of the Cold War, which is due to be published next year by Princeton University Press. Sheila is a Distinguished Professor Emerita of the University of Chicago and is currently based at the Australian Catholic University in Melbourne, from where she has travelled all the way to chilly, wintry Cambridge to speak to us this evening, for which we are immensely grateful. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to the floor to Professor Sheila Fitzpatrick.
Well, I very nearly tripped myself up on this, which would have been a difficult beginning. But anyway, I have managed not to. So I would try to speak to all of you, even though you're widely dispersed. So I'm going to talk about displacement and memories of loss, which is basically our workshop theme. And so that's why I selected it. At the very end, I'll say something about that book, Lost Souls, that I just finished, and try and tie it to the earlier remarks. So displacement is the situation of refugees, which in the wake of the Second World War were known, or who I should say, rather than which, who were known as displaced persons, or DPs. Displaced persons were defined by the international refugee agencies that looked after them as victims of war and fascism. Later, since when the dust settled, most of the remaining DPs under Allied control were people from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe who did not want to be repatriated to their countries. Later, they came to be understood in a different way as victims of communism, and I'll come back to that switch in definition of who they were. And as victims of communism, they were, of course, appropriate beneficiaries of Western aid in the Cold War. By the early 1950s, most of them had been resettled in the United States, Australia, Canada, Israel, and Latin America. Now, Australia coming so high up in the list, you may think that is just local patriotism on my part. Australia was actually the second largest, despite having a tiny population of 7 million at the time. Australia took nearly 200,000. So after the United States, they were the second, what would you call them, recipient, hosts or whatever, of displaced person resettlement. Now, displacement and migration both involve changing places, but whereas migration, unless it's forced migration, is assumed to be a matter of intention, displacement is understood as an accident, becoming a refugee. Migrants are seen as having agency, refugees as being deprived of it. In both cases, people who were formerly living in one place, part of one society and culture, citizens of one state and holding its passport, speaking one language, though not always, of course. These people travel through space and end up, after various adventures, living in another place, part of another society and culture, citizens or resident aliens of another state, perhaps with a different passport. All of those things have to be negotiated by them. That is part of the process of displacement, is the constant negotiations about your documents. And they may well end up speaking a different language. They've left their old location in the world and been planted or dumped into a new one. Now, authorities in the new location often encourage migrants to assimilate as quickly as possible, adopting American, Australian, or whatever values and mores, and becoming patriots of their new states. This involves putting their old lives behind them, and many resettled displaced persons, the DPs of the post-war cohort, were in fact happy to do that, happy to put the old lives behind them, at least overtly. They generally, judging by the Australian experience, they sought naturalization as soon as possible. Now that includes the people who had migrated to Australia but didn't want to stay. They actually needed a passport to leave, hence naturalization, so that you can get the passport that will enable you not to live in the country in which you have become naturalized. But they would seek naturalization as soon as legally possible to escape the category of statelessness to which displacement had assigned them. Nevertheless, when the census came round in their new country, they were recorded among those born elsewhere. That's normally a separate census category. Only with the second generation, and sometimes the third, did they enter the ranks of the native born. Now there's a Latin tag, and I actually forget where it comes from, Horace perhaps. Anyway, which basically says that when you move, you change the sky rather than your own spirit when you go across the seas. And that is a reminder that however much migrants are encouraged to assimilate and not to talk about the past, they in fact bring their old worlds willy-nilly into their new ones. The fact of having been born and brought up elsewhere will remain in memory after the resettlement following displacement, more or less vividly. Their status as foreigners, or after a while perhaps ex-foreigners in their new surroundings, will also not be forgotten. In the case of former displaced persons, people who were uprooted not by their choice, they may brood on the circumstances that uprooted them, dwelling on their victimhood. More rarely, they may see themselves as having seized opportunities that displacement offered them and made the best of a difficult situation. They may try to acculturate in the new place, but their children will necessarily do it better. They may prefer to stick with their own kind, other foreigners with the same language and background, but their children, when grown, are likely to move away. They may dream of returning home or angrily repudiate any such thought, or in rare cases, actually return. Displaced persons have memories not only of the places they have left, but also of the things they used to have there. And that's something that we're going to talk about in the workshop. It's not only people that get displaced, but also things. Typically, the displaced person makes it out with very little in the way of material possessions, only what can be carried. Particular things that are saved, those things that you carried as a displaced person, often acquire great symbolic importance. In the various individual cases that I happen to know about, copies of the Zeitschrift für Physik, which is a physicist's journal, in the knapsack of a 23-year-old would-be physicist was incredibly important. I think just 2 copies, but still, it was a start. I've often, perhaps partly being a violinist myself, I've come across people who took a violin with them. I've never heard of anybody taking a cello. I think that, for obvious reason, that would be more difficult, but a violin there, that really, I suppose it is often taken, and it also, it lends itself to all kinds of great stories about how it was thought that one's violin case contained a machine gun, and this and that person gave you trouble. Now, there are the things that when you're displaced you take, those few things, and then there are the things you leave behind. And some of those things will, as it were, magnify in memory. A particular painting, for example. One family I knew, they had left behind a Watteau painting, and that this became symbolic of the whole life that had been lost. Yes, often the emphasis will be put on a cultural object. A Bechstein piano is another one that comes up quite frequently. Now, as I say, when people are displaced, they take with them some things, including violins, but sometimes they leave them behind, as was the case with many valuable, after the Russian Revolution, a number of valuable musical instruments got lost, left behind and taken over by the state, which then reallocated them, which brings me to another aspect of things rather than people. This is the expropriation of things that occurred in the early Soviet period. That is the confiscation of the property of the bourgeoisie by the new revolutionary state. And in theory, it's redistribution to the proletariat. Now, this was displacement of things on an industrial scale. And the memory of specific losses are eloquently preserved in the pages of émigré memoirs. More displacement of things accompanied collectivization. If you read about decolonization, this is read specific, concrete accounts of it. This is all about the things, from the saucepans to the blankets to whatever that were taken from them to remove their privilege and redistributed to whomever. Now, at the end of the Second World War, a large number of things, both cultural objects and other kinds of objects, made their way from defeated Germany and Austria to the Soviet Union as trophy goods brought back by individual officers and soldiers. Now, here we have tremendous emphasis on grand pianos. And obviously, we're talking here about moving things by train rather than on your back, as the displaced person will often do. So grand pianos are always mentioned in the memoirs of the trophy goods brought back from Europe, although I think if anybody had ever been able to make a list of what's brought back, cows and horses would be more, there would have been more of them. The Soviet Union was, of course, not the only state to confiscate property. Germany under the Nazis confiscated the property of Jews, and in the wake of Germany's defeat in the Second World War, the process of restitution were instituted to return such property to the original owners and their heirs. Now, another form of displacement of things was associated with European colonialism in the form of acquisition of artworks and cultural artifacts and their shipment off to places like the British Museum, the Louvre, the Pergamon, or whatever. Now, these losses also left resentful memories, and after a while, after quite a long while, you had the development of pressures to return them to their original place, the reversal of the displacement of things that had occurred. And that tends to be a very long process that often ends in actual moving of the things. Now, all of these restitution claims can be contested. Sometimes the title deeds and details of acquisition are available, but often not. Indeed, where memory of past ownership is the primary source of the claim, there's room for all sorts of complications. For some reason in this text, I there have a personal story about a mandolin, which I can tell you about if you ask, but as I look at it, I'm not quite sure why you need to know about my mandolin. Displacement, it seems to me, should be a central object of attention for social historians and anthropologists. Our normal procedure is to look at society's social relations and questions of symbolic value in situ, which is fair enough. But nothing makes a person or a family or a home or a thing so vivid as their sudden loss through displacement. We often have the sense of fully understanding these persons or things for the first time in the aftermath of losing them, as centuries of elegies and funeral speeches attest. To be sure, this sense itself has to be treated cautiously, since it is mediated by memory, a notoriously unreliable source. But reliability is to some degree irrelevant. The sense of loss of national identity, attendant upon foreign invasion and occupation, rests on a collective memory that has more the character of myth than of an literally accurate account of the past, but that does not make it any the less strong, or as a memory of loss less real. In fact, as I started thinking about memories of loss, addressing my subtitle, it suddenly occurred to me, is there any memory that isn't about loss? In other words, memory is about things in the past. Things in the past are gone. So I throw that open to you to see if anyone can come up with memories that are not, to some degree, about loss. Displacement of persons, to move back to the humans from the individual, means that individuals with different trajectories being detached from one social setting via a period of transit put down in another. This brings to the fore processes that exist, but in less vivid and articulated form in ordinary, that is, non-displaced life. Displaced persons are in that liminal space between individual and community that cast both into particularly strong relief. In their new circumstances, presentation of self, including what one might call misrepresentation, is necessarily a constant preoccupation. Individual migrants have to reinvent themselves, although if they come with family, that poses interesting challenges because either you have to reinvent yourself together or the clashes between the reinventions may cause problems. with the DPs, the displaced persons, that self-reinvention is more than usually acute, because the wartime experiences of many of those displaced persons put them at risk of being accused of, put some of them at risk to different degrees of being accused of wartime collaboration. And so that's one of the kinds of things that you need to reinvent yourself to avoid. Now, diasporas develop collective memories of the life that was lost through displacement. And the local ethnic community, meanwhile, is interpreting, reinventing the past national community with abundant invention of tradition. That was one of the things I found with the looking at the DP camps, which were nationally organized. In other words, there'd be a Latvian, a Jewish, a Ukrainian national community, and all of them developing very much patriotic sentiments among their members, going along with a lot of what Hobsbawm would have called an invention of tradition. In other words, a cultivation of histories and folk practices that, whose historical existence before could be doubted, but whose utility for developing a sense of national identity undoubted. There's a growing divergence in these diasporas between what nationality and national patriotism means there and what it means back home. That, of course, could be seen, all kinds of interesting variants of that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the emergence of successor states, the reconnection of diaspora to these states. One could see that clash in many different iterations. Now, for the rest of this talk, I'll examine these general themes in relation to the Soviet and Baltic displaced persons resettled from DP camps in Germany, Austria, and Italy after the Second World War. That's the subject of my own recent research. Now, this is looking at the post-war displaced persons in a somewhat different light from what the bulk of the scholarship has done so far, because Jewish displaced persons, about a quarter probably of the whole, are the focus of more scholarship and often taken, as it were, as the quintessential displaced person in the post-war situation. But numerically, this is not the case, and in fact, I think the experience of Jewish DPs as against the Slavic and the Baltic ones is quite significantly different, not only because there's, to some degree, a different destination in that many of the Jews want to go to Palestine, to Israel, and do, but there's also a very different relationship to the Cold War, which I'll talk a bit more about later on. Now, perhaps all refugees' accounts of themselves, especially in retrospect, tend to emphasize their lack of agency, the victim status, the fact that displacement was not their choice, but the result of forces much larger than them and beyond their control. Post-war displaced persons made a particular point of this, and for good reason. They did not wish to present themselves as people who had ended up in Germany as a result of their choice, a wartime movement which they chose. And of course, in many cases, it was not a wartime movement that they had chosen, because they had ended up in Germany from their origins in the Soviet Union, Poland, or wherever, either because they'd been taken as forced labor, as Ostarbeiter, to Germany, or because they had fallen prisoner of war, and at the end of the war they were in German prison camps. That's what the situation is for the majority. but there is actually a minority whose departure from the Soviet Union or wherever with the Germans at the end of the war had been more or less voluntary. So there's a whole area of things that that in various circumstances people want to keep for themselves. That's particularly true of the Baltic DPs, because in general the people displaced from Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia had not been taken as forced laborers to Germany. The Germans didn't take that many people from that area. They could have, but they didn't. They took many more people from Ukraine. And the much more common scenario was with when the Germans withdrew from the Baltics with the Soviet army approaching, a lot of people left in their wake. Because this was the time that they were able to get out, and because they didn't want to go back under Soviet occupation. Nevertheless, this is a kind of departure that is not involves. It's in circumstances that are pressing on you, where your range of choice is limited, but it is nevertheless a choice. Now, as for the displaced person that came from Soviet Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, most of those had been originally displaced not of their own volition, as I've said, as Ostarbeiter or simply as soldiers who were subsequently captured. Although there are here too an element of choice exists, though in retrospect it's always very difficult to establish exactly what that was. When the Germans were recruiting labor in the East, initially it was on a voluntary basis, and later on it turned to more to compulsion. But there are some people who volunteered because they thought it would be interesting, advantageous, or whatever to go to Germany. Now, because that phenomenon existed of choice in going, sometimes choice in going to work in Germany, that meant that in the wake of the war, the whole group could fear that they could fear accusation from the Soviet side of having left voluntarily rather than involuntary. So choosing to depart was not, that was probably a minority only of the displaced person had chosen to depart, but nevertheless there is a minority there. And it was the first of many acts of agency available to DPs, which is not to deny that they were also swept up in processes over which they had no control. Now, when I started to think about the kinds of agencies they exercised, I was quite interested in how broad it was. The next big and mass exercise of agency was refusing to repatriate, because the original Allied sense of what to do with these displaced persons in Germany is, of course, to send them home, which by the Yalta Treaty they were supposed to do. But then they find that a lot of people won't go, and so they ended up not going. The international organization looking after them had to basically respond to this collective, not universal. I mean, lots of people went back. But there is the displaced persons, about 1 million of them who didn't. About 500,000 of those, a bit under 500,000, probably came from the Soviet Union. So choosing not to repatriate that's the act of creation, of making yourself a displaced person. Choosing which zone of Germany to go to was another possible act of agency. And this is a curious thing. If you look at the documents, it suggests that at every point, the documents of the international organization looking after the displaced persons, first UNRWA and then the IRO, they gloss over all these acts of agency because from a bureaucratic point of view, they're not meant to happen. So what the documents will tell you is displaced persons couldn't move between zones. There were very small windows of opportunity where they could, but in general, they're not able to move between zones, and they're not meant to move from one camp to another, and they're meant to live in camps, or as they call them, assembly centers. And none of this is true, actually. I mean, if you look at individual cases, in fact, you see that people were moving between zones. It's not that it's always easy, but they did it. They moved between camps a lot, because initially, and this is another act of DP agency, initially the Allies didn't really want to classify the displaced persons by nationality. It was not the Allies who came in and said there should be Jewish camps, there should be Latvian camps. This was the DPs themselves that basically said, we're not going to live with these other people. And that the Jewish DPs felt extremely strongly that they didn't want to live with any of the other groups. But it's also Ukrainians and Poles, and it was the general wish of the displaced persons to live in camps of their own nationality, all the more in that the agency in charge of them, UNRWA, believed in self-government for the DP, so they elect their own administrations, and so you want to elect your own people. And so that means that if you found yourself in the wrong camp, including one that maybe it could even be your nationality, but you don't like the politics of the people or whatever, so you move. I mean, you hear that there's a better one somewhere. And the DP grapevine, some people have described it as the best communication system in post-war Europe. So it was full of information about if you go to X place, you can get X, of information about what to do. Now, other kinds of choices that displaced persons could make, you could basically choose what to do or not to do anything in particular. In other words, if you wanted to work, you were allowed to work. And there was work available, mainly offered by UNRWA, but working for the Germans, not so easy, though not forbidden. So work was available to you if you wanted to do it, but you didn't have to do it. So there's a whole range of choice involved there. Of course, one of the choices of the kind of work which UNRWA, which nobody classified as work, one of the available choices was to work on the black market. And everybody did a bit of black market, but you can also take it as a full-time occupation, and many obviously did. So that's another kind of agency involved. And I'd also mention one final one. About 40% of the DPs are women, because the displaced persons were both male and female. Of course, they're not prisoners of war male, but so there's this fairly large group of women DPs, and the camps set up for them after the war really functioned. They provided food, clothing, housing, medical help, and childcare. And they're sort of mini welfare states, really. So one of the things that people do is have babies. That's an extreme. This is, of course, not counted as an occupation, but it clearly was the occupation that many of the women chose, because in material terms, it was really a fairly easy way, including as a single mother. There was much less stigma in the camps on single motherhood than in the societies that the DPs had come from, or the ones they settled in later. I mean, if there was an absent father, for one thing, there's been a war, right? So he was a soldier, he was killed. A soldier of whatever nationality, of the preferred nationality. The actual father, of course, in many cases of the forced laborers, the actual father was German, or else was a DP of another, a laborer of another nationality. But this was not really a big problem, and it's an absolutely huge birth rate that characterized life in the camps. Now, generally speaking, in the modern world, people are defined by their documents. They have file selves, in other words, bureaucratic doppelganger with specific ages, parentage, place of birth, citizenship. And under normal circumstances, you're kind of stuck with whatever of these characteristics you are known to have. But that didn't really apply to displaced persons, because the displaced persons, they were who they said they were, basically. There is no, the Allies didn't demand documents because if the DPs had documents, they had normally destroyed them, because it was, if they didn't want to repatriate, they didn't want it to be documentarily clear that they were, for example, Soviet. Anyway, so basically you are who you say you are. And that includes everybody loses, not everybody, sorry, but anybody pushing 40, and particularly female, loses a lot of years because of the, you don't want to be, many of the, if you're going to be resettled to find another home, they don't like over 40s. So you got younger and younger. Well, you could basically change anything, but I would say that age was one of the most common. Age and marital status. If you had been displaced, but there's a family back home, the basic thing is to forget about that. I mean, not everybody, of course, but an awful lot of people, and then to marry again. Almost everybody married or semi-married in the DP camps, as far as I could see, and surely lots of them were married back home. Now, you might say that there would be constraints of a linguistic nature. In other words, that if you wanted to call yourself a Pole, you should speak Polish. And I think that's only true up to a point, because the Allied officers, nobody knew any of these languages. And you're dependent on another DP interpreter. And let's suppose I'm Soviet and I want to say I'm Polish, because I don't want to be repatriated to the Soviet Union. I want to, there's a Polish interpreter, and I speak a sort of Russo-Polish, and the Polish interpreter knows perfectly well that I'm not Polish by birth, and that's not my native language. But is he going to tell them or not? There's a solidarity of DPs. He might, out of malice, but it's unusual. So basically, the interpreter is on the side, is another DP who's on the side of the DP, and will back him up in whatever. Now, after a while, the Allies actually they actually stated that a displaced person is whoever he says he is, and questions of plausibility are not to be raised. In other words, the very notion of challenging a person's account of themselves was repudiated. Now, as at first, the Allies didn't know what to do with the displaced persons. They were meant to repatriate them. They didn't want to repatriate them. Allies stopped they didn't want to force it. I mean, they did at first go along with forcing, and then they didn't want to do that. So what is to be done if these people are not going to be, if they won't go home? So for a few years there is doubt about that. UNRWA feels as if they should go home, and they shouldn't support any scheme other than that. But then there is UNRWA loses its U.S. financial backing, basically, and a new institution comes in, the IRO. And the IRO has a new program, which is to resettle. And that's That's a program that was extremely offensive to the Soviet Union because they felt that their people are being resettled in the capitalist world. They're being used as, they're being taken as well, slave labor was the accusation that they gave. But in any case, resettlement is a policy then adopted. And on the theme of self-reinvention, the process of resettlement and recasting of identities itself, a very interesting one. There's the first ship that went to Australia of DPs. They start taking them in 1947. And the first ship was the General Heinzelmann. And the Australians had said that they only want Latvians with blue eyes. Basically, there was a very great worry about Australians taking against people who didn't look and feel very like them. So the stipulation was the first boatload is going to be Latvian and preferably young men and women healthy and capable of being dressed in nice clothes when they arrive, and so it'll look okay. However, at the same time, Australia had said it only wanted to take manual occupations. They want people to work as laborers and in both agriculture and industry. And so those are the people they take. So the Heinzelmann, as the people were selected, and they fit the categories that were asked. So there were X number of builders' laborers, and there were others who were agricultural laborers, but they all fitted into this category of manual jobs. And the women were domestic servants, basically, and nurses in some cases, but not registered nurses, but at a lower level. Anyway, so those are the people that got on the Heinzelmann. Now, to go, the voyages, I don't know, what was it, 6 weeks or something at that time? And in that 6 weeks, a remarkable transformation occurred of the people on the Heinzelmann. When they docked in Sydney, immigration people went on the ship and they interviewed them. And this is how one knows about the transformation, because they're notes of their interview. So it turned out that the boat, as the immigration officer, who had forgotten evidently about the manual labor qualification, he said they're really very good types of people here. This was the good type means a middle-class cultured person, and listed. So there were professors of theology, there were opera singers, there were lawyers. It's an incredibly well-qualified group, and they had acquired this qualification since leaving Europe. And they had left Europe as horny-handed sons of toil, which was what Australia wanted. But once they arrive, they disclose themselves to be, all the domestic servants turn out to have degrees from University of Latvia, etc. So that's a particularly nice example because it is so well documented. Now, post-war displacement offers us an extreme case of the self-reinvention associated with changing one's location in the world. But it's not the only external circumstance that can produce such behavior, and I won't go into this in any detail, but once I started working on displacement, I realized that it connected much more directly than I had anticipated to my work as a Russian social historian, because after the revolution, this same process of self-reinvention was notable, because under revolutionary circumstances, the things that had given you status in the old society had now become things that you wanted to suppress. In other words, let's say that a part of your family came from the nobility and the other part didn't. Before the revolution, you would definitely say, I'm of noble estate. But after the revolution, you would definitely say not. And if you've got anything proletarian in your family, whatever it was that would have been the black sheep of the family before the revolution becomes becomes the basis of a new identity for the new situation. Now, when and this applies both to the Russian situation and to displacement situations, you can, of course, reinvent yourself out of whole cloth. You can simply give yourself a completely fake everything. But you're more likely to reinvent yourself by taking something out of your own or your family background and building on it. And as a matter of fact, I'm not going to, but I could even give a personal account of how that happens. I mean, the different bits of me in going to different places that have sort of come to the fore, not exactly by my choice, but I just noticed that they're different depending on what situation I'm in. Now, I'd say a little bit here about, I've been talking about individual self-fashioning of displaced persons, but there's also collective self-fashioning. And collective, in the case of displaced persons, that meant in the camp situation. And camps could be quite big. They were either big or small. They varied very much. And they also varied by the degree to which community was created there. But in some, it was really quite strong. And there is a great amount of energy in the camps devoted to the cultivation of national identity. It was put in terms of preservation. In some cases, in the case of the Baltic people from the Baltic states, often you have a perpetuation of the practices of creation of nationality, which had been characteristic of the new states. And they had collectively a similar problem of establishing a national identity as they came out of the Russian Empire. And the ways in which they did it are perpetuated in the camps. Now, most of the displaced persons came or claimed nationalities that were accepted as European. And that includes Soviet. Of course, in Soviet terms, nationality means something different, but forget that for the time being. Let's treat it as the same thing as citizenship. Now, Soviet citizenship, that conveyed at that time Europeanness. However, not everybody who came to the Soviet Union from the Soviet Union could completely meet that test, as when one confronts the Australian situation of a white Australia immigration policy, which is meant to exclude Asians, basically. Well, some of these people called the Soviet people are not going to pass that test, which Australian immigration did. They didn't fully deal with this as an intellectual problem, but they dealt with it by visually. In other words, they look at somebody and they thought, you don't look European. And then they would exclude them. But of course they didn't. Here's one of the examples where the documents are not very helpful to us, because even in Australia, which had the white Australia policy, you are not going to write, I excluded this man, this potential immigrant, on racial grounds. You just don't write that. You write something else, or say, not a good prospect, not a good type, that kind of thing. So that was the Australians who had a fairly straightforward attitude on the racial question, and did their best to exclude on a sort of ad hoc basis. Now, there is a very interesting case with the U.S. Immigration of the Kalmyks. The Kalmyks are not the only ethnic group coming from the Soviet Union whose suitability for immigration was contested, but they were the one who put up a terrific fight to get in to get to pass. American immigration rules didn't actually say that you had to be white like Australia, but it did say that you were meant, if you were coming under a displaced persons quota, you were meant to be European, because the displaced persons were European. So they questioned, the Kalmyks were displaced persons, but were they Europeans? And they basically said they were. They said that collectively, and they said that individually. And individually, the way they argued it was, I've got Kalmyk stuff in the background, but I've also got Russian. And I remember reading one. It said, I have 2 Russian grandparents and 2 Kalmyk grandparents, and that makes me 51% European. So anyway, that kind of argument at first doesn't seem to be getting them anywhere. But then their case was taken up by various religious groups and what we now call human rights groups in the United States. And an argument was developed primarily by a lawyer working for IRO called Oliver Stone, who is perhaps, I don't know, the father of the one that is now better known. Anyway, his argument was that because the Kalmyks had been exposed over many generations to Russians, treated here as Europeans, they had caught this Europeanness, and so they were okay, and they should not be excluded on racial grounds, and that argument was accepted by the Attorney General, and it could also be applied, of course, to other people, but it was the Kalmyks who were the best organized on that question. Now, I think I'll end this by making a bit of a jump to the book that I've just finished, the Lost Souls book, and bring in the whole question of the Cold War that I introduced very briefly at the beginning. Now, when I started working, the Lost Souls is the name of this book, and it is about the displaced persons claimed by the Soviet Union. Now, that means, in other words, they were both people who had been citizens of the pre-war Soviet Union and people from the Baltic states and West Ukraine and so on who had been absorbed after the Nazi-Stalin pact, unwillingly absorbed. So my aim was to look at those rather disparate groups and see all the different ways that their displacement ended. And you can repatriate, and that's a minority choice, but some people did it, and actually I found really good archives on that, so it's quite emphasized. You could get resettled, and that's what the majority do, or you could stay in Germany. That's also an outcome. And there was a minority of people that the so-called hardcore, very, very difficult to get rid of, the hardcore, and that includes, of course, the aged, the sick, the mentally ill. Nobody would take them, except the Soviets would take them, their own ones back, but other people didn't want to. And then one has another category, intellectuals, almost as hard to place as the disabled. That's what IRO recorded. And of course, the older and the more humanistic the intellectual, the worse. But Australia was very keen, very strong on the fact that, it's not just we won't take lawyers, we won't take writers, we won't take engineers or doctors. And IRO said to them, surely they could be useful. No, we've got our own doctors, we've got our own engineers. But anyway, it's the professors of philosophy who, if they did not manage to disguise themselves and get on the Heinzelmann, that tended to have the biggest trouble. So I didn't go into this study of displaced. I was simply interested in the different ways in which this dilemma can be resolved for different groups. But as I worked on it, I started to feel more and more these DPs were incredibly lucky as refugees because by From 47, they start being resettled, offered the possibility of resettlement, and almost all of them get resettled. And by 51, that process is largely completed. And where are they resettled? They are resettled in the first world, in first world countries, after having been put up quite comfortably, basically, as DPs. The biggest group are to the United States, which is where all migrants want to go, and it's free passage and so on. And it's not exactly true that it's not really the case strictly that you could choose where you could go, but you could choose where not to go. In other words, you applied to a country and you had to go through their selection committee. You might not be selected, but if, for example, you really didn't want to go to Argentina, no one was going to make you go to Argentina. So there's that degree of choice in there. So I thought about that. It's particularly striking because the two big problems that the United Nations, which has just been set up after the war, had, the two big refugee problems, it's a million displaced persons in Europe, and it's about 700,000 Palestinians in the Middle East. So there were two problems. And when you consider the different outcomes of those two problems, it's really quite striking. So I thought, why is that? What is it about the displaced persons that meant that their displacement is ended so comparatively quickly and so advantageously for it? So I then I went back to basically the question of settlement of a refugee problem needs money. It needs a lot of money. So where did the money come from? It comes from America. It had to be voted by US Congress. And US Congress was supporting the displaced persons straight after the war when there wasn't a resettlement policy. But they got sick of it and they sort of withdrew the funding or ended the funding. But then they resumed it with the resettlement policy, and they resumed it. It was the Cold War that made this possible, basically, because the displaced persons now are redefined. The understanding, they stop being victims of war and fascism, really, because they've come from countries that are now communist, and they decided not to go back. So what are they? They're victims of communism. And that is what made possible the funding. I think there's no question that without being victims of communism and without being able to develop a narrative and say, look, all these people chose to live in the free world and that shows that we're better, that outcome would never have occurred. And that leaves me with a final thought about DP agency, which is something I talked about quite a lot in the course of this talk. Having decided it's the change of definition of a DP that enabled their dilemma to be resolved. I thought, well, who changed it? How did it change? Because you've got initial statements that says a displaced person is a victim of war and fascism. That's all written down. But you don't have a later document that says, no, now they're a victim of communism. And when I thought about it, I thought, is it IRO that it comes from? Is it the occupation authorities? Who is pushing this idea? And then it dawned on me, it's the DPs who are pushing this idea. They are the ones who are saying that we're victims of communism, not the Jewish ones, to get back to that question about the difference between the Jewish and the Slavic and the Baltic ones. The Slavic and the Baltic DPs are seeing themselves as victims of communism, emphasizing it, and that follows the logic of having refused to repatriate. I mean, if you don't want to go home, you have to have a reason, right? And the reason may be complicated, but the way it boiled down was there is an easy way to say the reason, and that is not wishing to go back to a communist homeland. So I'm now interpreting, I see the DPs, the solution to that, as virtually a unique example of successful management of a refugee situation. I see the Cold War, rather ironically, as the reason for it, but it all I also I also see that crucial change of definition of what a DP is as something that comes actually from the DPs themselves.
Thank you so much, Sheila. Oh, is this on? Is this on? Okay, thank you again. Thank you so much, Sheila, for that wonderful lecture. We're going to open the floor to questions. So anyone in the room, if you raise your hand, we have roving mics, but I also have the Zoom open here, so people on Zoom, wherever you are, you can type messages into the chat. Do we have any questions in the room?
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much for that really interesting talk. And your point at the end about how the Cold War is sort of the driving factor in the resettlement of these DPs. It brings to mind first the sort of subsequent victims of communism, resettlement of Jews from the Soviet Union in the 1980s in Israel and in the United States. But also it, for me at least, raises the question of whether you think there is anything now, contemporarily, that would have such a motivating effect, and whether you think there is now, or you think there could be such an equally motivating factor.
Well, it's a really good question, and I thought about it once I decided they were so lucky. I mean, or rather, the outcome was so good, so uniquely good. I then thought, well, what have I a message for the world, which will say this is the way to do it? But I'm afraid I don't, because it seems to me that it was a really flukish thing. And I mean, in a sense, I see the Cold War as based on all kinds of misconceptions and really not exactly something one would involving a lot of collective misunderstanding, which just happened to work out for the DPs. But if anyone can think of a contemporary way, I mean, you know, it's when you start thinking in comparative terms about solving refugee problems. At this point, you know, the refugee problems are so great in the world, and you know, none of them seeming have easy solution. I haven't got an answer anyway.
There's a question at the back there.
Thank you, Sheila, for that. Just would like to know, those displaced people who, you know, have gone to places like Australia or United States, certainly after the Second World War, was there any inclination for many of them to return, apart from, say, for example, Jews to Israel, to their native countries with the end of the Cold War in 1990, or any maybe generations of those to return? I don't know if there's any documents or notes on that.
Well, it was an awfully long, it was a long wait. And so it tends not to be, and when you get return is with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and you get people going back to the Baltics in the largest numbers. So that's not the actual DPs, that's their children or grandchildren. But yes, there was, then not on a mass scale, and from Australia, I think largest from the US. One has quite a sense of a reverse process, particularly back to the Baltics, a little bit back to Russia, to post-Soviet Russia. But in Russia, the move, I'm now getting impressionistic, but my sense is that quite a few of the moves to the Baltic states became permanent moves, and this seems less often true of the moves back to Russia. You know, one hears of people being there for 10 years and then, you know, back to the United States or whatever. But before that time, I mean, it was one of the characteristics. Most migrants can at least, well, the possibility of returning home is a feasible one, or at least can be imagined. But that wasn't so of the DPs, because once you, I mean, in the Cold War context, once you're on the one side, you're not, I mean, no generalization is completely true, but you basically, the return was very difficult. Now, in the case of the The Soviet Union really wanted its DPs back, even when they'd been resettled. And they sent undercover agents out to various countries, including Australia, and these were the documents I found that I was so pleased with in the Russian archives. So they got these three undercover, one not dealing with one man dealing with the Latvians, and the others looking for General Soviet. So they're there for a year, talking to displaced persons and saying, we'll give you free passage back to the Soviet Union. And that, it's complicated to leave Australia. You needed an exit visa for one thing. So they had very little success, but a handful of people, I think about 14 people. And I just told you there are 3 people there working for more than a year. That's not a very big return on investment. And it was the same they had some people, somebody in Venezuela, they had somebody in London. I think that more went back from London for whatever reason. Well, it's closer, I suppose. But just a handful of people from the various Latin American countries. And it wasn't clear to me that somebody must have come back from the United States, but the numbers there were in the single digits, not even the double.
Amazing. We had a question here next.
Thank you very much. Really absolutely fascinating and to a large extent personal to me, because I came to the West as a political refugee. But I have kind of 2 questions. One is about the term displacement, and clearly most of your research is about people who were officially classified as displaced. So that's kind of very clear definition, and there were specific policies towards them as displaced. But very often now, and in our workshop, we'll be talking about displacement as a general kind of analytical concept. And we are kind of dealing with such a vast range of different experiences. And so I wonder what you think about the usefulness of the term displacement. Let's now leave the displaced object aside, but just to talk about such a vast range of, and I try to conceptualize such a vast range of different experiences. And secondly, it was interesting for me to notice that in your analysis, that the kind of class was absent in your discussion. And I'm wondering to what extent class has an impact, according to your research, on the experiences of these refugees. And it seems to me that, I fully agree that if we talk about the difference between the refugees from Europe who went to the States or Australia, and 700,000-800,000 Palestinians who became refugees, the fact that these Palestinians were peasants surely also played enormous role, apart from context, apart from the amount of money to support them, because peasants have very specific attitude towards land. And very often intellectuals don't understand them, because intellectuals are the kind of nomads. They can move around because they can sell their intellectual labor, and they can adjust very quickly to different cultures, or quicker to different cultures. And within the Soviet Union, when talking about Soviet experience, of course, as you yourself wrote about, that there were multiple displacements of people, and there were again multiple displacements within the Soviet Union, and indeed even outside, within my family. And again, there were vastly different outcomes between privileged intellectuals, who were my immediate relatives, and 2 peasants I knew. And both of them, one was from Ukraine, a woman from Ukraine who ran away because she managed to escape her village during Holodomor, and she survived. And another was from Smolensk, the same situation, sort of in the Russian part, which was struck by this famine. And they were ultimately servants in my family, and they never forgot their villages. And however well, sort of, my father's family, my mother's family treated these women, these were completely tragic kind of situations. And the fact that they were peasants and with, apart from obviously they lost their families and they served other families, that's not a very pleasant occupation. But Leningrad never became their real home. And I think that plays a role. I wonder whether you kind of noticed.
No, the whole class thing, yes. Well, I mean, in a sense, one could say that displacement, to some degree, declasses. But I don't want to push that too far. But that is partly in play. But of the displaced persons, of course, the majority were peasants. I mean, the biggest group was Polish. That's almost entirely, I mean, I don't know if anybody actually worked, but impressionistically, you read the accounts of the Polish camps, and so 80% at least is peasant. And the same with the Soviets. You see, I mean, Ostarbeiter have taken, lots of them were peasants taken to work on German farms. Now, what happened in the camps, I was describing the process whereby they get the camps, which were not meant to be national camps, become national camps. And they also tended, so what happened was that some group of that nationality would assume a leadership role, and that wasn't usually a peasant group. In fact, I think never, in my experience, was it a peasant group. In the case of the Russians, it was emigres. It was pre-war emigres who dominated. For various reasons, there were not Russian camps because that, basically because that made you too vulnerable to repatriation. But there, in fact, were a few, like Müncherhof, and they were the dominant group. The elected administration is the white Russian intellectual group, and the bulk of the what in Müncherhof was actually a labor force is Soviet peasants. Who are helped to become stateless. They're coached in presenting themselves as stateless, so as not to be Soviet, so as not to be subject to repatriation. And I think that to a degree, I mean, I remember reading an account of a Lithuanian camp that basically said the pre-war social distinctions were reproduced even in minute forms. And this even was manifest in the kind of housing within the camp that the old upper class was. But I have not, I can't say that of my own. I mean, that's not my own research, that's somebody's comment. Now, on the question of displacement and how broad it is, yes, I also have thought how broad it is. And the question of, and its utility, therefore. I mean, in a sense, when I've had these darts, it's partly by relating it to myself. I mean, I moved around a lot, more or less of my own volition, but still, is this displacement or not? And to what degree? But in the post-Second World War situation, displaced person was a legal category. I mean, it was the equivalent of you applied to UNRWA to be registered as a displaced person. And if there would be various reasons they would not accept you. If, for example, you were a white Russian who had not, been displaced by the revolution and not by the Second World War, unless the Nazis had displaced you again, you didn't qualify. Now that broke down after a while, but that was the original approach. And if you were a collaborator, supposedly you couldn't be a displaced person. So displaced person was a privileged status, no doubt about it. And that's, of course, one of the ironies of the situation. In post-war, in Germany, for example, displaced person is a status which entitles you to a ration, which is, I forget what percentage greater than what the Germans were getting, but significant. It was less than the occupying forces were getting, but you can't have everything. I mean, it was so it entitled you at that most basic level to more food, And that's not even counting the fact it entitled you to free housing and clothes and medical treatment and yeah.
I have a couple of questions in Zoom, which I might read out first, if I don't mind, and then we'll take another one from the room. There are a few questions from Anne Wilson, who asks, firstly, about the significance of the Berlin blockade, whether that had any impact on the experience of DPs. And then, regarding displacement of things, she asks, were you able to research records of the transfer of property of Baltic Germans to the German regime prior to their being moved to Poland? She says, secondly, I understand that later, post the collapse of the Soviet Union, Baltic Germans resolved not to seek restitution of their property. Is this correct?
I can't really illuminate that second question at all, although it's a very interesting one. The whole question about the situation of, well, I really can't illuminate the property situation. The people situation I know a little bit about, because if you were a Baltic citizen who had moved, a Baltic citizen of German origin who had moved to Germany in the late 30s, being called home to the, there was a sponsored program of move, and quite a few people left. Those people were not eligible to be displaced persons because they had chosen to move to Germany, and therefore it was not war and fascism. However, it was virtually impossible to tell them from other Baltic DPs. And in Misha, in my husband's family, I mean, he was not one of those, but lots of people from his school had been German Latvians whose families had decided to go to Germany at the end of the 30s. And those people, all of them managed to get DP status. The Berlin blockade, the way I've come, it certainly impressed on many of the DPs that Europe was a good place to get out of. And it helped the resettlement process because the feeling became very strong in the DP camps that there's going to be a Third World War and it's going to take place here. You know, Germany is going to be at the center of it. So if there's a boat taking me to Argentina or Australia, I'll get on it.
Thank you. Let's have the question from here next, in the front.
I was fascinated to learn that the Kalmyks were portrayed as Europeans in order to overcome the kind of racist immigration laws of that period. But also, I think they were, some of them were highly educated. And the result was that the pharmaceutical industry in the United States was very supportive and pitched sent letters to the government to have them come in and to play a role in developing new drugs and new therapies and so on. That's why they wound up in New Jersey, which has a long history of a pharmaceutical industry.
Oh, that's really interesting. No, I didn't, and it's not in the various sort of caches of documents on the Kalmyks that I found that, I mean, the people settled in New Jersey, according to is it the Church of the Brethren? That was quite something. Right, but so I've been offered an alternative explanation of why they went to New Jersey. So the pharmaceutical was absolutely not represented in. I mean, one of the big sources I got, it was I think a Baptist minister who involved himself very closely in. So anything about the pharmaceutical part was somebody else was doing that, but that's really interesting.
You mentioned with the Latvian migrants the want for skilled workers in Australia, but later in your talk you mentioned how Australia didn't want skilled workers. So what changed?
Yes, well, Australia continued to say it didn't want skilled workers, so it is in a way very strange that when the Australian immigration official goes on board, he seems to forget that Australia's policy is to take only proletarians and peasants, and reacts in this sort of straightforward, he applies what must be his personal standards of desirability, saying what good types, these typists and these people that you would expect to be not very good types. I think Australia, there are many aspects of Australia's policy that are full of contradiction and sort of ignorance. And one of the things, Australia said, yes, we want only labourers of whatever nationality. But then they said, but we'd better get Latvians because they'll look okay when they arrive and the press photographs them, and that will be easy. And then they said it'd be good if they spoke English too. Now, once you say it'd be good if they spoke English, you're not going to get horny-handed. You're not going to get too many proletarians who have good English. And so while they, in a sense, I gloss over that to make it a better story, but there is a contradiction. In their selection, they said all the time that they're going for labourers. And yet at the same time, they are clearly also looking for people who would look all right arriving at the dock, in Australia, and also who could fit in by speaking English. And those things are contradictory to a degree.
We have time for...
Caroline has a question.
Yeah, great. Let's have one from Carrie.
Thank you. Thanks, Sheila. Wonderful talk. We've been dealing with this displaced person category, which is one invented in Western Europe and America. And I wondered, in the case of the people who are repatriated or decide they want to go back to the Soviet Union, was there any category in the Soviet vocabulary for these people? I mean, what are they when they come back? And do they retain something of their, if they've changed a little bit, they've reinvented themselves, they're now X when they had started out as Y, is that carried through into what happens when they get back to Russia?
If only one knew, yes. I mean, nobody, one can only say, it's very hard to know even what kind of sources you would look for at this distance to find out what they did, because they would only get into the archives if they got arrested, or they were up before the authorities in some way. In other words, there is a category of repatriate, but it is in practice, it is a marked category, but it's not one that the repatriating authorities want to be particularly stressed, in part because they would expect that the repatriates would run into trouble. I mean, not just from the then equivalent of the KGB, but from neighbours, because they'd been that as people who'd returned from abroad, they would be under suspicion of having these wrong kind of values. So I think that wherever possible, you tried completely to suppress this on return, but that is not to be found at all in the archives of the repatriating authority, which is intent on pretending that there is no danger of stigma, and tends to, the way they report it, that we found a wonderful job for this woman in her own specialty, and she has been welcomed by the collective. So, and that is with the assumption that everybody knows who she is. But in practice, I think if in your first job it was known that you'd come back as a repatriate, you would leave that job and find another job where it wasn't known.
Thank you. We still have time for a few more questions. We can take some more from the floor. Yeah, there's a couple over here. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm thinking about in, say, Miami in America, how Cuban displaced people after the revolution there have sustained a very sort of strong anti-communist policy that's prevented sort of rapprochement or a shift, to normalize relations with Cuba. And you talked about how these displaced people sort of benefited from, a shift against communism. But I'm interested in, did they subsequently help sustain that? Did they start, within the societies that they'd moved to, sort of advocate against, sort of rapprochement with the Soviet Union and normalization of relationships?
Well, they, at first, in the United States, and I think in Canada and Australia as well, they were welcomed as anti-communists, and so they went around, holding up that banner, "We are anti-communists, that's why we're so particularly desirable as immigrants." And everything goes very nicely until the 70s. And then in the 70s, the whole question of war criminals comes up. There starts to be a worry that war criminals have come in with the post-war displaced persons. Well, they had, but this is raised again, and that means that these diasporic groups suddenly find themselves in a situation they had not anticipated, and rather than being sort of being fine, upstanding anti-communists, they're possible collaborators. And this happens it starts in the United States. The identification of war criminals who the United States then tries to deport them. They don't prosecute. They accuse them specifically of lying on their immigration applications, and they're deporting them on that basis. And Demjanjuk was the last such case. But it's all very difficult, because if they come from the Soviet Union, you can't deport them back there. That was the thinking. The war criminals thing gets big in the United States, 70s, 80s, still going on. Similar tribunals or similar processes are set up in Canada and the UK, in Australia. And in all cases, they result in a number of investigations, thousands of investigations of post-war migrants and these DPs. Very few prosecutions, because at that point it's difficult to prosecute. And there's a question of the evidence, in fact, comes from the Soviet Union. Soviet Union is eager to present the evidence, but not everybody is prepared to accept that it's okay. But after a while, in the US, they do accept it. But now the diaspora communities then have the problem of what is our attitude? In other words, do we say, yes, we want to find any war criminal who may have come into our community? Of course we do. And they sort of say that, but of course they really don't welcome this at all, because they feel collectively that their whole identity in the new country has been, there's a bit of spoiled identity here. What were upstanding anti-communists that we welcome become suspected war criminals that we don't welcome. So you have in the 80s and the 90s, it goes on up to the 2000s actually, and by that time, more or less the last one, there's no one left. Most of the prosecutions fail, and there are a few convictions and a few deportations, but the whole question of where to deport becomes. And if you got deported back to the Soviet Union, they knew how to deal with you. But for that reason, people didn't want them to. In Australia, there's a really strange story goes on and on and on with the Latvians. The Soviet Union had repeatedly, since the early 60s, they had demanded of all the countries of resettlement of DPs, they had sent out lists of war criminals. They said, this person is living at such and such a street in Adelaide, and we have evidence of his crimes, which is usually mass murder of Jews in the Soviet Union during occupation. And please, when we want you to extradite him. And Australia refused, Canada refused, all these countries refused. And finally, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in one Latvian case, there was one person in Australia who had been sought by the Soviet Union for decades. and all kinds of things that happened with this case. So now you have an independent Latvian government, which actually doesn't really want to prosecute the war criminals all that much, but it was sort of awkward not to. And so they asked the Australians to extradite him. And the Australians said, yes, they would extradite him. And then he died. And so that never actually happened.
Amazing, thank you. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. There was one down here, one there.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was really fascinating. I hope we can discuss a bit more in the workshop. But I have an immediate question that I'm not going to be able to ask later because it's related to my main work, sort of. It's related to this idea of whether this reclassification as victims of communism, whether it's driven by the DP agency or other bodies. And I found working on the internment of enemy aliens in Britain that there was a kind of discussion among sort of combination between police, various internment bodies, and MI5 was a significant sort of, the subject came up. So in other words, basically refugees that were interned, that were initially classified as victims of the Third Reich, were actually also interned if they were communists, so as kind of potential fifth columnists that were communists up to the Hitler-Stalin, so up to sort of in the duration of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. But after the attack on the Soviet Union, they were then reclassified and quickly released. But there was a debate whether there's a case to be made to still keep them because it's still not sort of really trustworthy and so on. But I was just wondering whether such material might come up also in the case of DP treatment, that sort of other ideological motives might somehow emerge in the institution.
They didn't. The debate within the International Refugee Organization that I've come across, it's not involving the communist bit at all, which they just let happen, but it involves the collaborators and the categories of people who had originally been viewed as not suitable for DP status because they were under suspicion of collaboration. As the IRO sort of comes to complete its work, they realize that there are all these people they haven't let into DP status and therefore can't be resettled, and therefore what's going to happen to them? And they're going to be left in Europe. So they say to each other, they say in internal discussion, what can we do? Basically, they then announce a new policy, which is called liberalization. And liberalization means being much more relaxed about who was a collaborator. And so all kinds of people who had never been admitted to DP status suddenly become DPs in 1949-50 so that they can be resettled as DPs with the free passage. So, but that's what they're for, and they're embarrassed about it, the IRO people. I mean, they really actually don't like doing this very much, but what are you going to do? Otherwise, you're leaving this big problem. But so that's what they worry about behind the scenes. They just, I mean, the communist thing, they talk about it in the IRO only. They talk about it as an American quirk. In other words, the Americans have gone crazy about communism, and they're rejecting some people on security grounds. And they do have a discussion about, should we let other countries know that the Americans have rejected this person as a communist? And that would queer his chances with everyone else. And they decide, no, we should not tell. We'll keep that because it might not be true and it damages their... But that was the only thing they looked at. And of course, that's a severely practical thing, really.
Thank you. I think with that, we're running out of time, and I might draw us to a close now. But I want to thank the audience for coming in the first place, and thank you for all your wonderful questions. We could continue this discussion, and we will, as has been mentioned a few times, be having a workshop tomorrow, which you can still sign up for, where this discussion will keep going. But I'd like you all to join me in thanking, of course, Professor Sheila Fitzpatrick for such a wonderful evening.